Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege and honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, especially at this time as the House and the Senate hurtle towards some type of perhaps collision and sometimes or perhaps a conclusion to the drama that's taking place over the funding of our government. And it seems as though the focus of all this comes down on Obamacare. But I'd like to first, Mr. Speaker, paint the picture on how we got here. And it's this. The House has consistently passed a budget. And then the House passed legislation that essentially required the Senate to finally, after over 1,000 days, pass a budget over there themselves. Of course it was a token, and of course it was pushed off to the side, and of course it wasn't something that could be reconciled with a responsible, legitimate budget here in the House of Representatives, but it met the criterion narrowly. And so the functionality of this Congress, which has been in the past 12 or so appropriations bills passing here, starting here, being messaged over to the Senate, where when things worked right, the Senate picked up those appropriations bills, and through their appropriations process, their hearings, their deliberation, their subcommittee and their committee process, worked their will with the House bill that had been messaged to them, and one at a time, 12 or 13 appropriation bills would work their way so that they had passed the House in one form and generally the Senate in a different form, in which case a conference committee would be appointed, and House Republicans and Democrats would sit down with Senate Republicans and Democrats, hammer out the differences in one of 12 or 13 appropriation bills, and come to an agreement, send the conference report to the House or the Senate for passage, in which case it would pass both, be messaged to the President. That appropriation then would be concluded and fulfilled. And a responsible government starts with hearing from our constituents, usually in December, November, December, and January. And as we look forward to the end of the fiscal year, which happens next Monday night at midnight, we are working towards getting all of our government funded appropriately. And in those months of January, it starts up, and then in February and March, the intensity of hearing from constituents and their budgetary concerns, the appropriations hearing in the Appropriation Committee, and then here on the floor under an open rule, bill after bill after bill, a dozen appropriation bills are debated, and the open rule that allows amendments to be brought forward on that to adjust the appropriations up or down and perhaps transfer some of those appropriations. The House works its will, the Senate works its will. We come together and agree on a conference report. We send it to the President signs it, and those departments of government that are funded by that appropriation bill then are given their budgetary responsibility and their spending authority for the upcoming fiscal year. That's how it has worked in the past. It does not work that way under this dysfunctional setup that exists today. What happens now in Congress that we have, Mr. Speaker, is this. The House debates the appropriations bills, 12 of them or so. We've passed several of them at this point in the House. We've sent them over to the Senate. They go message to the Senate, where they arrive at the Majority Leader Harry Reid's desk. And figuratively speaking, Harry Reid then puts that appropriation bill in his desk drawer and closes the drawer, not to be discussed or heard from again for the balance of the fiscal year. And another appropriation bill goes over, and another, and another, and another. And what you see happen is, we've seen this happen in the past where we have passed, I remember under Chairman Jerry Lewis, the appropriations chair at the time, all of our appropriation bills by July. Messaged them all over to the Senate, where they all would go into Harry Reid's desk drawer. And at the end of the fiscal year, sometime about now, or maybe a week ahead of this time, Harry Reid would look around and think, oh, hey, we're facing a government shutdown if I don't get those bills out of my desk drawer. And so he pulls out a dozen appropriations bills. Each one of them is a collective judgment of the majority of the United States House of Representatives, constitutionally messaged to the Senate, stacks them up, and takes his little marker through there, and he draws a line through the appropriations that he doesn't like, and he writes in all the line items and puts on all the Christmas tree spending that he does like, and he puts in the wish list of the senators that he wants to help out, so to speak, and some are Republicans and many are Democrats. and he creates this omnibus spending bill. Sometimes we call it omnibus if it doesn't show up at the end of the year. Otherwise, if it's the expiration of our spending, of our appropriations, as it is now, we call it a continuing resolution. We've been operating on continuing resolutions for too long. And it isn't because of Obamacare necessarily that we're at this point today. The leverage has been created because Harry Reid didn't deal with our appropriations bills. And furthermore, he's not going to deal with our appropriation bills. He is going to create this crisis so that it increases the leverage that he has in defeating the will of the people, which is to shut off all the funding to implement or enforce Obamacare, Mr. Speaker, to put an end to its implementation, to not let Obamacare become implemented because, first of all, I don't agree with the decision made by the Supreme Court. I think it's completely inconsistent to declare a bill to be a tax as it arrives at the United States Supreme Court, to declare it not to be a tax as it arrives at the Supreme Court for the purposes of considering the issue of the litigation on Obamacare, but then to declare it to be a tax as a decision of the Supreme Court. It can be one or the other. Either Obamacare is a tax or it's not a tax, but it can't be conveniently not a tax for the purposes of whether the Supreme Court would grant cert, and then conveniently a tax for the purposes of declaring that it is constitutional. But that's the decisions that were made by the United States Supreme Court. All of us take an oath to uphold the Constitution, everyone in the House and the Senate, and of course the Supreme Court as well. And we can't be taking an oath to uphold a decision that no one that I know of in America predicted. You would think, Mr. Speaker, that of all the constitutional scholars we have that had been writing and reading and thinking and analyzing Obamacare, that had watched as, by legislative shenanigan, hook and crook, that patchwork of Obamacare had been jammed through the House and the Senate in a fashion that would not have mirrored any process we had ever seen before. They'd seen the time that the Senate had a filibuster-proof majority, and I remember going into Christmas Eve, the vote that was taking place over there on the 20th on Christmas Eve of December. And I remember when the Senate had the ability to delay that vote from 9 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve morning, December 24th, till 9 o'clock that night, which truly would have been in Christmas Eve. And I sent the message over there to my senator, and I said, please delay that vote as long as you can. Keep that thing delayed until the last possible minute. If they want to jam this country and give us a Christmas present of Obamacare so badly that they will sit there on Christmas Eve, keep them there then and let them miss Christmas with their families because the flights will be gone out of Dulles by then. That's what I asked that it happened. There was a negotiation that took place, allowed an agreement from Republicans that there'd be a couple of votes in January that they wanted on some taxes or something of that nature. So they had a vote at 9 o'clock in the morning, December 24th, that allowed for Obamacare to move ahead one more time. And then I wrote back and I said, what do we do now? To my senator. And his answer was, pray, and pray for a Republican victory in the United States Senate race in Massachusetts, the special election because of the passing of Senator Teddy Kennedy. None of us thought on December 24th that year that the following January 18th or 19th, that's very close to the election date, that Scott Brown would be elected as a United States Senator out of Massachusetts. That is what happened. That was the people in Massachusetts rising up and saying, we don't want Obamacare. We reject Obamacare. We'll even go so far as that entirely blue state of Massachusetts that had a delegation of 8 members of Congress, every single one of them a Democrat, and none of them known as conservative Democrats by the measure that I know. That's Massachusetts, and they sent us Scott Brown. And they're the ones that had the most example with something that looked like a preview, perhaps, of Obamacare. So who knew more than the Bay Staters about this? Who had the most loaded politics that should have been electing a Democrat in that election? No, they said, we don't want to see anything that looks like Obamacare, and we're going to send you a young, fresh Republican whose job it is to help kill Obamacare. And he came here and began to engage in that effort and was significant in his role. And my hat's off to former Senator Scott Brown. But in the end, legislative shenanigans defeated even the voters in Massachusetts' will, and they put legislation through back over from the Senate under what process they call reconciliation. They carved out some, put it into the reconciliation process to avoid the filibuster because they no longer had a filibuster-proof majority. The people had spoken, and then the legislative shenanigans began. While that was going on, there was a drama here in the House. Now, that takes us to March of that year. And the drama in the House was that there were the Stupak dozen who said, I'm not going to vote for an Obamacare piece of legislation that will fund abortion. And so the president made an offer, this is what's reported in the news at least, Mr. Speaker, that he would write an executive order that would nullify the Stupak amendment or nullify the ban on funding abortion. And that promise was made by the president before Obamacare was passed in order to get the votes to get Obamacare to pass here on the floor of the House of Representatives. Now think of that. The President of the United States, a former adjunct professor of law at the University, professor of constitutional law at the University of Chicago, made a promise to a Democrat congressman from Michigan who presumably controlled 12 votes of the unnamed Stupak dozen, who were anonymous, oddly, that it's hard to think you're going to control votes if nobody knows who they are. But in any case, the president making a promise that he would sign an executive order that would nullify some of the language that's in the law. And Congressman Stupak took that promise, and the former adjunct constitutional law professor, President Obama, made a promise that said that the president thought that he could amend law immediately after, actually after he signed it into law. Now, what constitutional professor would take a position like that? I dig this up for a little bit, Mr. Speaker, because I want people to understand this piece of Obamacare legislation is not the will of the people. It never was the will of the people. It's a product of hook and crook and legislative shenanigan. It's done against the will of the people. And furthermore, Thomas Jefferson, whom both parties revere, once said, large initiatives should not be advanced on slender majorities. Large initiatives need to be bipartisan initiatives, not completely 100% partisan initiatives, which Obamacare is. And the slender majority that Thomas Jefferson was talking about was a slender majority that he previewed at least, or presumed to be, a bipartisan majority. If Jefferson had been talking about a partisan majority, it would have been very clear, in my opinion, what he would have said. He would have said, large initiatives should never be advanced on partisan majorities. That's what happened with Obamacare. The largest initiative that has been jammed down the throats of the American people in its entire history is Obamacare, advanced on a purely partisan majority by utilization of legislative shenanigan and hook and crook. That's what got us to this point. And people wonder, why don't you just throw up your hands? Why don't you accept reality? Obamacare, the land, let it be. Fund it, because the people have spoken. Well, the people had spoken. They spoke when they elected Scott Brown. And in the aftermath of the passage of Obamacare in March, about March 20th or 21st of 2010, the people spoke again that following November. And I remember when Obamacare passed in the night, and I had been battling this thing for days, and I went home about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe a little later than that, but it was when the business wound down here in the House, Mr. Speaker. And I went home and I thought, I'm going to lay down and I'm going to sleep the sleep of the exhausted, and I'm going to get completely rested up, and I'm going to wake up in the morning, and then I'm going to put a plan together on what we do now. Because I knew that the bill was messaged to the White House, and I knew the president was salivating to sign it. Well, he did that within about 48 hours. I woke up, though, in about 2.5 hours because the wheels were turning, and I couldn't take it any longer, and I drafted the language to repeal Obamacare and had that formal request to get that bill handed back to me by the draft people we have here as when the door opened at 9 o'clock that morning. And we've been doing battle with Obamacare ever since. Not only me. A gentle lady from Minnesota that was down here and led an hour special order earlier today has been standing in there and ran for president on the issue, Michelle Bachmann. And no one wondered what she would do if she were elected president. She'd have repealed Obamacare. Louis Gohmert has been putting hour after hour here and on the floor and around this country doing battle with Obamacare. The list of people that deserve credit for stepping up to this fight is long. And it isn't exclusive here in the House, Mr. Speaker. It certainly includes a group of stalwarts in the Senate, led latest episode by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who stood on the floor for more than 21 hours and delivered a whole series of arguments against Obamacare. But I'll say here's the argument that is at the center of Obamacare, Mr. Speaker, and it is this. Obamacare is, by my opinion, an unconstitutional takings of God-given American liberty. It takes away our right to manage our health. The most sovereign thing that we have as the American people is our soul. And our soul, the eternal nature of our soul, is controlled by God and our will. This federal government hasn't figured out how to nationalize our soul. But the second most sovereign thing we have is our bodies, our health, our skin, and everything inside it. It's the second most sovereign thing that we have. And the federal government under Obamacare has figured out how to nationalize our skin and everything inside it. A federal government takeover of the management of our health, where under Obamacare, if you walk into a clinic, if you walk into an emergency room, if you apply for government-approved insurance under whatever means it might emerge, when no one really can tell us at this point, the government decides whether you get the insurance. The government decides whether you get a subsidy for the premium. The government decides what kind of research gets done, what kind of treatment one gets. The government decides if you're worth the hip replacement or the knee replacement, or whether you get just painkillers for as long as you can live with a broken hip. The government decides that, not us any longer. Now, we understand that, those of us that have a little bit of gray hair, or maybe have lost some. We understand that, but do the children in our grade schools and in our nurseries today understand that? Mr. Speaker, we know that answer is no. They don't understand that. When these children grow up and they get out of school and they step into adulthood and they've already been brought up in a system of Obamacare that makes these decisions for them, what happens to their dreams? What happens to their aspirations? What happens to their ability to think big? What happens to their ability to manage their life? The institutional memory of the culture and civilization will disappear that remembers the glorious time when we could choose our doctor, when the market demand created the insurance policies that suit us, the consumers, when we could shop from doctor to doctor, from clinic to clinic, when we could say, but you know, I want this care for my mother this badly that I think even though that she is 85, she needs a hip replacement because I don't want to see her die in a wheelchair. That's a different world than that we have today, and I'd be happy to yield to the Speaker.
Suspend. The Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed with an amendment to H.J. Res. 59, making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The gentleman from Iowa may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Speaker the number of that H.J. Res. that's just been messaged? I missed that.
H.J. Res. 59. H.J. Res. 59, the continuing resolution.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you for that response, and now that tells me, Mr. Speaker, that we've just gotten messaged to us the continuing resolution from the United States Senate that the vote had concluded over on the other side, down the other end through the rotunda. And the Senate has now acted to peel out the ban on funding for Obamacare and send us back what they would call a clean CR with their changes and provisions, which would include a continuing resolution up until November 15th. So it is a shorter-term CR than we offered to them. But what it says is we as senators are not going to we're not going to fund Obamacare, or we're not going to let you prohibit the funding of Obamacare. And so again, we're back to the center and the crux of this. Another dramatic event has taken place here in the United States Capitol. And the drama of this now is in the lap of the House of Representatives, where our Speaker has just received the message of H.J. Res. 59, the CR. Now we have a decision to make. And my message, Mr. Speaker, is this. If 218 House members hold our ground, if we say we will not fund Obamacare and we will not fund an appropriation that fails to cut off the funding to Obamacare, if we hold our ground, we will win. This contest now that's going on, it's a contest of wills. And there's a relatively narrow majority in the Senate. There's a little bit broader majority in the House, I believe. And the strength of will is being measured. This is like holding a gun on each other now, standing in a burning building and deciding who's going to blink. But we can't just let down the hammer and stand there because the building is burning. Somebody's got to walk away from this confrontation and say, I'm going to give you your way. Well, my message to this, Mr. Speaker, is that we've heard this message over and over again. If there is a government shutdown, Republicans will always lose in a confrontation with the president. I don't know that that's true. And I don't know that it even was true in 1995 and 96 when there was a government shutdown that lasted for 21 days. What I do know is this House sent the funding to keep our government open over to the Senate. With it was language that said no funding to implement or enforce Obamacare. It happens that's language that I wrote and presented here in this Congress in February of 2011. We have said we want this government to stay open. We want to avoid a shutdown, avoid a shutdown, avoid a shutdown. If we repeat that enough times, it might be sending a message to the senators that we really don't mean it when we say that we're not going to fund Obamacare. I want to send the message, Mr. Speaker, that we do mean it. And I want to send the message that we're going to hold our ground. And I'd like to remind, Mr. Speaker, that there have been a whole series of shutdowns throughout history. And as I looked through some of those, and I have a list of them printed here, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 government shutdowns when Jimmy Carter was president. 5 of them. 5 incidents. One of them was over a nuclear battleship or a nuclear ship of some kind. And the longest shutdown he had was 18 days. Does anybody remember those shutdowns from the 80s? Kind of. It didn't change my life that I remember. But that was Democrats in majority in the House and the Senate. They had a Democrat president. And their infighting caused government shutdowns for a total of 57 days. 57 days in between 77 and 1981. And sometimes Jimmy Carter won. Sometimes the Democrats in the House and Senate prevailed over the President of the United States. All the same party. So if we don't remember the price paid for a government shutdown, if the inconvenience of it doesn't linger in anybody's memory, I'd take you to the era of Ronald Reagan, when there were a number of shutdowns under Ronald Reagan, fewer and for a shorter period of time. One of them was over $1 billion in social spending. And of that $1 billion, the government was shut down for about 3 days. And in that period of time, by the way, there was a Republican majority in the United States Senate. We had a principled Republican president, Democrats in the majority here in the House. The Democrats refused to agree with the president and the Senate. It resulted in a government shutdown. And in that shutdown that lasted, at the end, the $1 billion in spending that Democrats here wanted was negotiated down to $900 million. They gave up 10% of what they asked for, and the government was opened back up again. So, a determined majority in the House of Representatives prevailed to the level of 90% of their ask against a Republican majority in the Senate that opposed them and a president who has clearly held his ground in case after case. It isn't clear who prevails in an issue like this, but I'll say this. The American people will judge our resolve and our determination. And the determination on who wins and who loses, if that actually matters, will be written by history. But I say this, Mr. Speaker, if we hold our ground, I believe there will not be a political price for House Republicans to pay. When House Republicans held their ground and eventually caved, in 95 and 96. Some say House Republicans lost that. They lost 8 seats in the following election. They did not lose the majority. 6 of those 8 seats were marginal seats they were likely to lose anyway. So perhaps they lost 2 congressional seats. Now, if we don't want to put at risk 2 congressional seats out of the House Republican majority to stand on the principle that cuts off all funding to implement and enforce Obamacare, is our fear for our political jobs greater than the principle and the people we represent? I would argue instead that there will not be political consequences for standing on principle and refusing to fund Obamacare. If there are political consequences, they will be recovered from over time. But we, Mr. Speaker, can never recover from Obamacare if it's implemented and enforced. That is the bottom line. No political consequences will be delivered to the people who stand up for the American people. That's the House Republican stance. That's the Senate conservative stance that came a little short over here a few minutes ago down the other side of the Capitol. But if we stand together as House Republicans, as Senate Republicans, as principled people who look back at that time and saw that Scott Brown came to the United States Senate because the blue state Massachusetts rejected Obamacare. There was a wave election in 2010 that elected 87 new House Republicans. Every one of them ran on repeal of Obamacare. Every Republican in the House and Senate has voted multiple times to undo, repeal, unfund, defund Obamacare. All of us stand together. It was bipartisan the last time. We had 2 Democrats that also agreed with us on this CR. We must stand on principle. If there's a political price to be paid for standing on principle, I say it's worth it. We can recover from any political price, even though I don't believe there will be anything but a political reward. But we can never recover if we allow Obamacare to be implemented or enforced. That's my stand, Mr. Speaker. That's the stand that I ask my colleagues to take today, tomorrow, the next day, and every day. If we hold together and we hold strong, in the end, the beneficiaries will be the American people and God-given liberty. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move